that, let's go ahead and get started with today's social studies class. We're going to discuss the electoral system. So without further ado, I will pull up my handy dandy government PowerPoint. Hopefully everyone can hear and see me okay. I apologize if you were watching me try to do this from my basement. It did not go successfully, so I'm back in a more reliable spot. So anyway, we will go ahead and get started. So if you have questions, again, make sure you ask on the chat, and Caleb and I will try our best to answer them, and we'll just kind of get started. For the sake of simplicity, when we talk about our electoral system or how people are elected, for the sake of this conversation, we're going to focus on the federal government and like the presidential election. So what happens every 4 years when we elect a president? This is kind of the cycle we go through. And so we're not looking necessarily in detail at local elections, state elections, or elections for other positions. We're kind of just looking at it from presidential elections. So when we talk about parties or party systems, right, we're not talking about throwing a party. We're talking about political parties. So what is a political party? Essentially, a group of people that share views and interests and opinions on how government is performed. Right? There's probably a little more to it than that, but for simplicity's sake, that's essentially what it is, right? So if you see here on the slide, we've got one-party system, two-party system, and multi-party system. So across the world, there are lots of different structures of government. Right? We talked about that last week. And there are lots of different ways that countries have their political parties divvied up, or some have one, some have two, some have lots. Okay? So obviously a one-party system is a political system in which only one party exists and routinely controls the government. So it doesn't necessarily mean that there's only one party. It just means, and the key here is this last part, routinely controls the government, right? So take communist China, right? It's a one-party system. In other words, the people representing the Communist Party are going to be the people that are elected into office. Right? There isn't a viable second party to contend with them, right, for winning any elections or controlling the government, right? So, and that's the bigger thing, right? So a two-party system is a political system in which only two parties compete for control of the government. So with that being said, right, the obvious difference between that and a multi-party system, guessed it, right, is a political system in which many parties exist and compete for control of the government. So think about what do you have any guesses as to what type of party system the United States has? You might have a guess, you might know, you might have no idea, and that's okay, right? But kind of think about that to yourself for just a second, right? And this is a little confusing because even though in our country we have lots of different political parties, there are, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but there are a lot of different parties. But we're considered to be a two-party system because really there are only two political parties in the United States that compete for controlling the government. And so that would be the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. Okay? Those are our two main political parties in the United States. So if I go ahead and switch the slide here, now we're looking at kind of just our country, so not political parties in general, just kind of our specific party system. So we have, again, our two main political parties, which are the Republicans and the Democrats. You've probably heard these words. You maybe know a lot about them. You maybe know nothing. You maybe try to close your eyes and block your ears every time you hear people talk about politics. And that's okay, right? You've got time to kind of learn this stuff and figure it out as you go. I didn't care about politics at all until I was well into my 20s. right? So that's just kind of the way it goes. You kind of figure this out as you get older. So first, before we talk about some of these third parties, so again, we mentioned that the United States is a two-party, right? But there are lots of other parties. So I guess I'll skip this section up here and mention the third parties first. So all of these other different parties down here, so independents, libertarians, Green Party, socialists, communists, so on and so forth, right? Those are all different parties that exist in the United States. But the reason that they are considered third parties, right, is because all of them lumped together represent a very small portion of our government or of our political parties. They're the vast minority. And so they kind of lumped them all together into what we call the third party. They're all vying to be that third option, right? Even though the top two options are kind of way above in terms of power, popularity, influence, so on and so forth. Okay, so we don't need to kind of run through all of these different parties and their different ideals or their different opinions on things for the sake of this conversation, maybe another day. But I want to focus briefly on talking about the kind of main differences between our two major parties. And I'm going to do it in a way that's just very, hopefully, objective, unbiased, not putting my personal opinions kind of into it, and just looking at what the two sides are, what things they represent, what things they value, what things they don't, and leave it at that. Right? So up here we have Republican versus Democrat and conservative versus liberal. So those terms are often tied together, right? So Republican and conservative are tied together. Democrat and liberal are often tied, but they don't necessarily always mean the exact same. So when we talk about Republicans and Democrats from a governmental standpoint, in terms of, right, but from the standpoint of how they think government should be run, right, taking out social, cultural, ideological views, just looking at how government runs, the main difference, right, is that Republicans value a weaker, centralized government that interjects less, that does less, that allows for more freedoms, and that's allows for more freedoms makes it sound like they're more freedom. That's not quite what I mean. Therefore, not regulating things, leaving people to do things on their own, leaving the economy to run on its own, not interjecting as much, but overall they're in favor of having a smaller, weaker government that does that. Okay? So on the flip side of that, Democrats think that the centralized government, the federal government, should have more power, should be more proactive into helping people, provide more funding to people, right? So in other words, they think government should help out more. Republicans think government should help less and just kind of oversee things and let things run on their own, right? Hopefully that kind of makes sense. So just from a government standpoint and kind of historical ideas. Now those are always kind of slowly shifting and changing. And those aren't necessarily the way things are today, but historically that's kind of the way things are. Republicans and Democrats both spend money, right? When they're in control of the government, Republicans tend to spend their money certain places. Democrats tend to value different things and spend money in other places. They both tend to spend money. So that brings me to my next point. And we don't need to get wrapped up in talking too much about the parties. I don't want to kind of bore you. You don't need to be an expert in these to be great on the test. But I do want to talk about kind of the difference between conservative and liberal, right? So whereas when we use the terms Republican and Democrat, we are really talking about, right? But conservative and liberal are tied to more of the social, right? Or the cultural, things that you value personally. So conservatives tend to value things and again, I'm stereotyping or not stereotyping, but trying to be general and summarizing kind of these two things in general. I'm not speaking for all conservatives. But conservatives tend to have more traditional values, values that have been valued in the past, right? Things that were important or that have been important historically, things that, let me see, what are some other ways to say that? More conservative, right? You've heard that term, right? But I don't like, and I always criticize you all for doing this, so don't ever define a word using the same word, right? So in general, things that are more traditional and the way things have been traditionally done, conservatives like to keep that, right? If something has been this way for so long, conservatives would say, well, it's been that way for so long, and we should leave it that way, it's been fine. Whereas liberal people, on the other side of that, tend to be more forward-thinking in terms of shifting values or shifting beliefs. Say, well, even if this is the norm now or has been, maybe it should be changed. Maybe we should be talking about changing this or that, or, right? So it's more of a looking backward versus looking forward. And again, I'm not adding judgment into that. We're not trying to, at least, right? But that's kind of the main difference. So if you take an issue, and I'll just kind of go through a couple of examples, right? Not many, right? So the Second Amendment, right? The right to bear arms. Conservatives would say the Second Amendment has existed since the beginning of our nation. It's always been that way. I want to value that right, and I want to continue it. It's always been the right of U.S. citizens to bear arms. Whereas liberals, again, I'm putting everyone into, one big bucket. Whereas a liberal person may say, yes, that has been the case, but people 200 years ago had different needs than people now, and maybe there is no reason to have everyone have the right to keep and bear arms. Maybe we should look at that and maybe change it or revisit it and alter itself. Right? And so again, that's overgeneralizing both sides, but that's just an example. For legalized marijuana, right? That's something where on the conservative side, you have something that was illegal for years and years and years. You had people on the liberal side saying, well, it was illegal, but maybe we need to revisit that and think about changing that law because maybe people's values are different and there are benefits for it, and maybe we should, instead of trying to fight the drug lords who are bringing it into our country, maybe we need to legalize it, regulate it, tax it, collect money on it, and then also monitor the people using it and try to get it to be in the hands of people that are kind of responsible. So again, two different viewpoints on the same issue. So that is kind of the big difference between conservative and again, that's, we can go on and on about it, but I really want to try to keep it short and sweet. So with that said, I'm really rambling on here, so I apologize if I lost you already. But try to bear with me, and then we'll get to some practice questions here in a second. But down here on the bottom, where it says election process, that's really the nuts and bolts of kind of what I'm hoping to get to. Right? So the election process. So we have a national presidential election. Okay? The first thing that we have is the primary elections. So the primary elections right now are kind of going on as we speak. Typically, in any given election, and it's not always the case, sometimes you have both parties with new candidates. Oftentimes, like we have now, we have an incumbent or somebody who is currently serving as president, and that person will serve as the Republican nominee for this upcoming election. So right now, the Republican primaries, although they're happening, they're not really decided because the nominee has already been decided. If you look at what's going on right now with the Democrats, primary elections have been going on throughout the course of this year. Washington already had their primary election, right? The primary elections are where you vote amongst people from the same party. Okay? So if you're a Republican, you will vote amongst the nominees for who you want to have represent the Republicans as the presidential nominee. That makes sense. And on the flip side of that, the Democrats will do the same thing. You're only voting amongst one or the other. You're not voting between a Democrat and a Republican. You're voting between the same party. So, primary process is designed to kind of weed out all the nominees and ultimately end up with one person, right? Which the Democrats now have done, right? The primary process is essentially run its course. There were however many, there were 20-ish candidates, or there were 22, something like that, right? When the Democratic process started for the Democrats, there were tons of candidates. Now, over this course of the last few months, it's down to one. So that kind of brings us to our next step, which is the nomination. So nominations happen when the party officially names the candidate, right? So that's typically done at the Republican Convention and the Democratic National Convention, which will happen this summer. But as it stands now, it's kind of already decided it's down to two people to run for this upcoming election. But the conventions will still happen, and they will actually nominate officially that person to represent each party. Okay. So down here, the general election. The general election just means the main election. So now we've gone through the primary, where we're voting amongst people from the same party. We had the nomination, where the people were chosen. Now we have the general election, where you are voting for people from the different parties, right? So on the presidential ballot, if you're old enough to vote this November, right, you'll have a Democrat, you'll have a Republican, and you'll have all those third-party candidates as well. And so you will vote for a person from one of those parties. You can't vote for more than one. You can't vote for people from the same party. There's only one representative per party in the general election. The general election happens, and then lastly, the last thing we'll talk about before we do a few practice questions is the Electoral College. So the Electoral College is kind of the body that ultimately votes on and decides who wins in an election. So here is a map of the representatives that each state gets. But the way that a presidential election works is it's not necessarily tallying up all the votes and the person who gets the most votes, right? We know that, or at least hopefully we have an idea that that's not the case, right? Because it often happens where the president, or the person that wins the popular vote, in other words, the percentage of the votes, isn't necessarily the person who wins the election. Because our election is based on this map here. So typically the way that it works, although not every state has to do this, there's nothing written into the Constitution that says the states must allocate all of their votes for candidates. There are some states that split them up according to who gets what percentage, but in general, the vast majority of all these states, all of our 50 states, right? So take Washington, for example. We have 11 electoral college votes. Whichever of the candidates wins the general election in Washington, president gets the most votes in the state of Washington, that person gets all 11 of these votes, right? And it gets piled up to the national total, right? And whoever gets the most of these votes, or these electoral college votes, wins the presidency. So it's indirectly related on who wins percentage-wise, but in the end, it's done on a state-by-state basis, and then all those numbers are tallied up. So, like, obviously, the person who wins California, right, gets a lot more votes towards winning the presidency than, say, whoever wins Alaska or Wyoming or South Dakota, right? Those people, those states have way less people, so they have less electoral college. All right, so hopefully that kind of makes sense. I see we've got about 10 minutes, so sorry for just kind of running through that. Hopefully you're not too lost or too bored. If you are, I apologize. let me go ahead and stop sharing this, and I will share some practice questions. And I invite you to answer them in the chat. If you want to answer them privately to me or to Caleb, that is fine too. You don't have to group chat them to everyone, but just to kind of a way to interact and kind of see if we can replicate kind of more of a real class this way. So again, I invite you to share your answers with me, or if you want to post them to everyone, that's totally fine. But we're going to at least do the first three. So let's kind of just see what we get. And hopefully you're looking on a computer and not on a phone so that these are not minute. I'll try to zoom in as much as I can. But let's just start with number one, okay? So number one here, I'll pull up my chat. So number one, which of the following is necessary for a candidate to win the presidency? So just kind of think about what we talked about. Right? Which of these four things is essential or must happen, right, in order for the candidate to win the presidency? A, earning a majority of primary wins. B, receiving a majority of the popular vote. C, receiving a majority in the Electoral College vote. D, having no third-party opponent. Give everyone just a few seconds to kind of think about it. Respond if you want to respond. If you want to just write it down or you want to tell it to yourself and not share it, that's fine too. I just want to try to get you to actively be doing these questions. So which of the following is necessary for a candidate to win the presidency? Okay. So if you've answered, great. Not, I'm just going to kind of start going through them a little bit, kind of answer by answer. So A, earning a majority of primary wins. So remember, primary elections are what? They're elections that happen before the general election. So in the presidency, it's not necessarily mandatory that you earn a majority of primary wins. Now, that typically is the case of the candidate. That's not necessary. A, although it's a decent option, not necessary. It's not. It is not something that must happen. B, receiving a majority of the popular vote. Remember, receiving a majority of the popular vote means winning the election based on percentage, right? National. But like I said, the presidency isn't decided on popular vote. Right? So it's possible and often happens. Well, I wouldn't say often. Has happened frequently recently, but over the course of history, it is somewhat rare, right? But it is possible to actually win the election and lose the popular vote. So B is not true, right? B is not necessary. C, receiving a majority in the Electoral College. Sounds pretty good. Let's check on D first. Make sure D is not a good option also, and then we'll come back and move on. So D, having no third-party opponent. So again, not necessary at all. Almost everyone who runs for president and wins is going to run against a third-party opponent. There are lots of them. They tend to get a very, very small percentage of the vote, but no, not necessary. So the only thing necessary here is C, receiving a majority in the Electoral College. Because remember, that's what dictates who actually wins the presidency. Who wins the most votes in the Electoral College. Okay. Let's go ahead and skip down to number 2 here. And hopefully you can read that okay. If you want to read it to yourself, feel free to turn my volume off if you would like. Kind of go through it yourself. I'll read through it for those of you who kind of want me to just guide us through it. And I think we'll do number 2 and we'll do number 3 and we'll call it a day there. that I have a little bit of time in case anybody wants to ask any questions or talk about anything. So number 2 says an exit poll is one that surveys people as they leave a voting location. So you go vote, on your way out, someone asks you to answer a question or whatever, and they take that data and they put it into the poll so they can broadcast it. Right? So instead of waiting for votes to be counted, the media often will announce the winners of elections based on these exit polls, right? Because it takes a long time to tally up all the votes and actually see who wins. And of course, like everything in our country, we want information fast. So exit polls are a way that the media can project or guess who's going to win based on these exit polls right on the scene. Which of the following is an important drawback? So the key word here is drawback. Drawback is a good thing or bad thing? Drawbacks are a bad thing. So what is one of the big problems with using it? Right, so we're going to read through these options, see which one of these sounds like an issue or a problem or a potential drawback. Okay? And again, feel free to answer in the chat if you are so inclined, and you can answer privately to me or privately to Caleb, and you can check your answers. That's all fine. And again, if you want to just answer for yourself. So, A, exit polls may be inaccurate if the people polled are not representative of the political unit as a whole. The election is very. B, exit polls allow the media to present election results during prime time on election night instead of waiting until later. C, exit polls have undue influence on the way politicians running for office conduct their campaigns. Or D, exit polls are likely to be unreliable when there is a wide margin between. So, one of these questions is a lot to read, and it's easy to kind of read it and have it go in one ear and out the other. So try your best to kind of break it down and look at what are some of these options that just don't. And again, there's lots of vocabulary. So if you struggle with knowing what some of these words mean, then these questions are going to be hard. And the best advice I can give you, if that's the case for yourself, is practice reading, attend reading class, do a lot of practice questions, right? Get used to the way they talk and types of questions that they're going to ask, right? There's no shortcut for learning vocabulary. I can't give you a list of all the vocabulary that's going to be on the test. You just have to be prepared to find some words you may not know, try to figure it out on the fly, and kind of see how you do it, right? So for me, if this was me answering this question, and I guess it is, talking to myself, right? If I was given this question on a practice test, I would look for a couple that really stand out as being. So the first one that I would throw away is B. Exit polls allow the media to present election results during prime time on election night instead of waiting until later in the evening. That is the reason exit polls exist. That isn't a drawback. That is a positive thing. That is the one good thing about exit polls. So it's not answering the question. It's true. Again, it's a true statement. But it's not answering the question. In fact, it's answering the opposite of the question. Right? So B is the first one I'd throw out. Okay? B is one of the important positives of exit polls. So that's the reason I would throw out. Okay? And the next one that I'd probably throw out would be C. Exit polls have undue influence on the way politicians running for office conduct their. Think about what that is. Think about what that's saying for just a second. Exit polls happen when? After people have voted. After the election is essentially done. Not done, but after people have made up their minds. Right? Campaigns are essentially the thing that lead up to election. Right? So campaigns are happening before elections. Right? Campaigns are basically what's a way to define it? So the person's attempt at becoming president, right? So get a big staff together and you kind of orchestrate this whole thing, and your goal is to try to win all these primaries, get to the general election, and become president. Campaigns happen before elections, whereas exit polls are happening after. So there's no influence on campaigns by exit polls. Right? Those two things are happening simultaneously. So I draw out C. So look at A and look at D. Exit polls may be inaccurate if the people polled are not representative of the political unit as a whole, or if the election is very close. So it's basically saying that A is trying to say exit polls are likely to be incorrect if either it's a very close race, right? Or if they happen to poll people that don't really represent the nation as a whole, right? So when we talk about, in science, we talk about sample size, right? Your exit poll isn't gathering enough data. Right? It's easy for it to be a little bit inaccurate. In other words, you might be in a state where there are more Democrats than Republicans, so the exit polls might skew that way, right? Let's look at D. D says exit polls are likely to be unreliable when there is a wide margin between candidates. In other words, the exit polls are likely to be wrong in the situation where you have a big gap between the candidates. One of those is true and one of those isn't. And in this situation, B is the one that's false, right? A is the correct answer. Think about it. If exit polls are just getting a general sense of what people's votes are, then they should be fairly reliable if there is in other words, one candidate is way above the other. Okay? Exit polls might vary a little bit, but not enough to really be wrong. Whereas A, think about that, exit polls are not perfect. They're just kind of getting a general sense of things. If the election is very close, then it's possible for those exit polls to be wrong. So anyway, enough over explanation of a question. Let me go ahead and stop there. We can do number 3 tomorrow, or we can move on. It's not the end of the world. If you do want more materials though, just let me know or let Caleb know, and we can get you some. Let me see.